What do you see as being the mainspring for that coming about?
Well, one concern I have is that the China hawks in the U.S. in the U.S. and the U.S. hawks in China feed on each other, and if we can't handle the U.S.-China relationship, then there's this split, the China-Japan democracy mainland, rim democracy mainland split, and that worries me some. That worries me some. I think we have learned pretty well how to handle the China relationship, and Chinese have also been somewhat restrained, but you can never rule out a Taiwan problem. We have a new election in this month, I think it is, in Taiwan, and it's likely that someone named Ma Ying-jeou will win, and he favors closer relations with the mainland, and that's good, I think, but you never know what's going to happen. So that's one concern. I think another concern is I do worry some about sort of the revival of ethnic conflicts and instability in some parts of Asia. I'm thinking of the fragility, still fragile nature of Indonesia. I'm thinking of the clash between Muslims in the south, the southern tip of Thailand, that fled over into Malaysia. And I guess my last, but I think those, I'm not too worried about that, but you can't rule that out. Papua New Guinea and Aceh, these areas are still volatile. But I think the biggest threat really is not one that I haven't talked about much, and that's environmental. Climate change is threatening this entire maritime region in the longer run. Pollution in that part of the world is terrible. That's disease is another related threat. So I think those things. Yeah, destabilizing threats. Yeah. Even in China, there are a large number of popular disturbances that are caused by environmental pollution. One thing some people see as a threat, and I guess I should mention it, is the possibility of an implosion in China itself. There are such incredible tensions in the social structure, in the widening income gap. The Chinese themselves keep track of any demonstration more than 10 people, and it's something like, yeah, well, this is a demonstration. And the numbers have been growing into the tens of thousands. It was something like 76,000 demonstrations of one kind or another in China. Sometimes when people are pushed off their land, sometimes when there's an environmental scandal, sometimes a corruption scandal. And if you know something about Chinese history, you'll know that when the central government has been weak, there has been a tendency for China to fragment into warlordism and separatism and so on, which explains in part why China is so uptight about Tibet and worrying, was to hold on to its territory. There are people who think that China could have some social or economic collapse, and that would drag all of Asia down because China's been such a growth engine. I don't see that happening myself. I used to be a China hand long ago. In the midst of time I was trained, but I'm not a China scholar anymore, but I do keep in touch with China scholars. But that would be a disaster, and that's why we should do everything we can to help China get richer. This is not a consensus view in this town. But I met with the deputy mayor of Shanghai. A small group of us did a few years ago, and this deputy mayor was just talking about the sheer scale of the unemployment caused by the closing down of these dinosaur state enterprises and the absolute lack of a social safety net. I mean, you're talking dimensions here. And the migrants from the countryside, that there are as many as 200 million maybe, and that's not a wild estimate, of people who are floating around China who used to be on farms. As agriculture gets more productive, as more land gets taken over for other things, people start flocking to cities. I mean, it's a huge problem. And so China has its hands full dealing with its social, economic, and environmental problems, but I don't actually see an implosion. But that would be a serious, serious problem. You may have some other threats. Have you got any threats in mind?
One question I was kind of curious about, is some of the labor shortage in Laos and China, whether or not that's going to lead to getting labor flow.
Well, Vietnam is getting the overflow, and after Vietnam, it's Indonesia and India. It's interesting because I mean, all I can say is that Chinese opinion polls seem to be optimistic about the future, despite this. I mean, it's a problem for companies, you know, but and the wages are going up in coastal China, particularly. And Chinese are always trying to get people to invest in the interior, but nobody really wants to go very far away from the ports. But Vietnam is gaining a lot. I bought some pantsuits for a trip to Asia last spring, and I noticed both of them were made in Vietnam. And way up in, very far up in Vermont, in this ancient, almost empty town, there was some hippie who'd opened a store, and I bought a nice cotton dress that said "Made in Indonesia." You know, so you never know. You never know. You never know. But no, Vietnam is the big beneficiary. If you talk to Ray Burkhardt, who's a former ambassador, I mean, he just thinks the grouping Vietnam with Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. They're called the CLMV countries in ASEAN speak. And he thinks grouping Vietnam with the other three is completely out of date. He says they're just booming. So far, China, as far as I know, China hasn't had any social problems associated with that. They're all just hungry for education. Yes? Yes. Yeah, this is a very rich subject, much debated at the Peterson Institute, and I am by no means an expert on it. It's been such a deal for us. You know, we just go on charging and buying and consuming, and we print up these little pieces of paper, little green pieces of paper, and they all sort of flow into the Chinese hands, with the result that China owns a significant part, as you just said, of our government paper. Let me say a couple of things. First of all, people worry that this gives the Chinese enormous leverage over us. I think actually it's like what they say about a borrower at the bank. If you borrow $10,000, you know, you're vulnerable. If you borrow $75 million, you know, then there's a mutual dependence. And so I think the Chinese have, just as we have a stake in their prosperity, I think they have a stake in our prosperity, and I don't think they're going to do anything alarming with this. They have a lot of very smart, you know, Berkeley PhDs in economics, Bank of China people. They're very careful. They don't move very fast. They certainly don't move as fast as we would like on appreciating their currency. But I think that's because of this delicate domestic, social, and political situation that we were just talking about. I mean, sudden changes in the exchange rate, I think, would throw things out of whack. But that doesn't get back to your point. They did sort of break the link with the U.S. dollar, and what that meant, among other things, was that as the U.S. dollar has fallen, their currency didn't fall with it. They are now beginning to pile up big surpluses in Europe, which they didn't have before. Our own export performance has improved somewhat since the dollar began to fall. There's talk of an Asian currency unit, which would simply be a basket of currencies, but that hasn't really gotten off the ground. The Chinese have their own reference currency basket, but we don't know what it is exactly, apparently. But I don't know. I think that I always come back to the physician heal thyself, you know. I mean, we really can't go on spending like this and remain an economic leader.